Hi everyone. Detective Lefebre speaks. The phone call came in on a rainy Tuesday morning. It was from Grace Moran, the director of Haven Outreach, a local nonprofit that provided aid to homeless individuals. Grace sounded desperate. Detective, she began. We've been hit. A significant portion of our community grant money is gone, and I think one of the people we're trying to help might know something. I pressed her for details. She explained that the funds had vanished through legitimate-seeming transfers that no one in her organization had authorized. It doesn't make sense, she said, exasperated. The system should be secure, but I can't shake the feeling that Ezekiel is involved. Who's Ezekiel? I asked, jotting the name into my notebook. Her reply made my ears perk up. He's brilliant. He shouldn't be living on the streets, but he's always saying things like, if I wanted to, I could outsmart this whole system. It was a tantalizing lead. I promised to look into it. Before meeting Ezekiel, I dug into what little was known about him. Officially, he didn't exist. No ID, no tax records, nothing. But informal accounts painted a different picture. Shelter volunteers described him as a kind but enigmatic man in his late 40s, with an uncanny ability to solve problems others couldn't. He had once helped a social worker optimize their funding reports, finding errors that saved the organization thousands. But there were darker whispers, too. Some claimed Ezekiel had a habit of appearing in places he shouldn't, like behind locked doors or near computers left unattended. Others said he had a vendetta against banks and bureaucracies, though no one could explain why. Everything about Ezekiel screamed potential suspect, but also fascinating enigma. Finding Ezekiel wasn't hard. He frequented the same park bench every morning, feeding pigeons with the crumbs he scrounged from day-old bread. As I approached, I noticed his appearance. Ragged clothes, a scruffy beard, but an unmistakable air of dignity. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I felt as though he could see right through me. "You're here about the money," he said before I even introduced myself. His voice was calm, almost serene, as though he'd been expecting this conversation. "That's right," I replied, trying to gauge his reaction. "I'm here to ask a few questions." Ezekiel smiled faintly. "Questions are the beginning, detective. Answers are where the fun begins." Our conversation was a verbal chess match. He never admitted to anything outright but dropped hints that he understood the inner workings of financial systems better than most bankers. When I pressed him, he gave me an unsettling smile and said, "You'll find what you're looking for, but only if you know where to look." Back at my office, I dove into the nonprofit's financial records. The transactions were flawless, each one bearing the appropriate approvals and matching the nonprofit's usual patterns. Whoever had orchestrated this theft hadn't just hacked a system. They had studied its every nuance. The money was funneled into multiple accounts, each under different names. These accounts were then emptied, the funds disappearing into thin air. When I traced one of the account holders, I discovered they had died years ago. Ezekiel, or someone working with him, had used the identities of the deceased to mask the transfers. What baffled me was how someone without access to high-end technology, or so I thought, could pull off something so sophisticated. I needed to know more about Ezekiel's capabilities. I returned to the park a few days later. Ezekiel was there, humming a tune as he fed his feathered companions. This time, I decided to cut straight to the point. "Ezekiel," I said, "I know you're involved. The money's gone, and you've left just enough of a trail to make me curious. Why?" He looked at me with genuine amusement. Curiosity, detective, is a powerful thing. It leads to discovery, and discovery, well, that's where change happens. "Stop dodging the question," I snapped. "You've built something, a scheme. Why steal from people trying to help?" Ezekiel's smile faded slightly. "Stealing? No, detective. I'm demonstrating. The system is rigged. It's flawed, and all I did was show its weakness. If I wanted to, I could take everything and leave nothing." It wasn't an admission of guilt, but it was close enough. Ezekiel spoke like a man who knew he was playing a game only he could win. I left that conversation more determined and more unnerved than ever. Just when I felt like I was chasing shadows, a break came in the form of a nervous young man named Tyler, who worked part-time at Haven Outreach. He had called my office saying he had something urgent to share, but didn't want his name in any official reports. We met in a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Tyler was jumpy, his eyes darting around like he expected Ezekiel himself to appear out of thin air. "Detective," he said in a low voice, leaning across the table, "you don't know how smart this guy is. I overheard him talking to someone last week at the shelter. He was bragging about how he could hack into accounts, and no one would ever trace it back to him." I raised an eyebrow. He admitted to hacking? "Not exactly," Tyler clarified. "He called it a mental exercise, but he described it in such detail, it was like he'd already done it." "What kind of details?" I pressed. Tyler hesitated. He mentioned things like creating ghost accounts and using public computers to stay anonymous. He even joked that he could make the system work for the people it ignores. The information wasn't concrete, but it painted a clearer picture of Ezekiel's mindset. Tyler's description matched everything I'd seen so far. Someone too brilliant to leave a trail, but bold enough to leave breadcrumbs to make sure I was paying attention. I called in a favor from Samir, a digital forensics expert I had worked with in the past. Samir was a wizard with computers, the kind of guy who could find a needle in a digital haystack. I handed him the financial records from the nonprofit and asked him to trace the ghost accounts Ezekiel had allegedly created. Samir worked his magic, and the results were astonishing. The diverted funds had been funneled through a series of accounts registered under names that seemed ordinary at first glance. But Samir discovered a chilling detail. Each name belonged to someone who had died in the past 5 years. Their identities had been resurrected digitally, used to create accounts that could bypass standard fraud detection systems. "This is next-level stuff," Samir said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "The person who did this isn't just tech-savvy, they understand human behavior. Look at this." He pointed to a set of transactions. Each transfer happens at odd hours, during shifts when bank employees are least likely to notice anomalies. Ezekiel's handiwork was meticulous, almost artistic in its precision. But one question lingered. How was a man with no access to private resources pulling this off? That answer would come soon enough. Ezekiel's enigmatic behavior and the brilliance of his scheme began to weigh on me. I spent long nights poring over evidence, trying to connect the dots. My apartment looked like a cliché detective's lair. Papers pinned to walls, red string crisscrossing maps, and half-empty coffee cups scattered everywhere. Ezekiel's cryptic warnings replayed in my mind. "It's not theft if no one catches the thief." It felt like he was taunting me, daring me to step into his labyrinth. But what gnawed at me the most was his motive. Was he driven by necessity, revenge, or some twisted sense of justice? The case began to take a personal toll. I found myself staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., wondering if Ezekiel was awake too, calculating his next move. A breakthrough came unexpectedly. I received a call from a pawnshop owner named Carl, who had heard about the investigation through local gossip. He claimed to have sold a high-end laptop to someone who matched Ezekiel's description. I visited Carl's shop, a cluttered hole-in-the-wall packed with everything from vintage guitars to antique watches. Carl greeted me with a knowing grin. "You're looking for the brainy hobo, aren't you?" "Ezekiel," I confirmed, showing him a photo. "Yeah, that's him," Carl said, leading me to his back office. "He sold me a laptop about 2 months ago. Top-of-the-line machine, barely used. He said he didn't need it anymore, but I could tell he knew his way around tech." Carl showed me the transaction record. Ezekiel had used cash, as expected, but the timing was suspicious. It was just weeks before the nonprofit's money started disappearing. I asked Carl if Ezekiel had bought anything. Carl scratched his chin. "Nope, but he seemed to know a lot about encryption. Told me he didn't need a machine to do what computers could. Said, the brain's the best algorithm there is." It was a chilling realization. Ezekiel didn't need sophisticated tools because his mind was the ultimate weapon. Ezekiel's use of public resources became the next piece of the puzzle. I obtained surveillance footage from the city library, a place he was known to frequent. The grainy black and white footage showed Ezekiel entering the library late at night, wearing a heavy coat and gloves. He moved with purpose, heading straight to a row of public computers. For hours, he sat there, typing methodically. The gloves were a clever touch, no fingerprints to leave behind. What struck me most was his calm demeanor. While others fidgeted or took breaks, Ezekiel was focused, as if the rest of the world didn't exist. I interviewed the library staff, who confirmed that Ezekiel often stayed until closing. He's polite, always cleans up after himself, one librarian said. But I've noticed he never asks for help with the computers. He knows exactly what he's doing. The footage showed one other curious detail. Ezekiel always left precisely 10 minutes before the library closed. It was as if he wanted to ensure there was no chance of his activities being reviewed in real time. Armed with this new evidence, I knew I was dealing with a man who anticipated every move. Ezekiel wasn't just a step ahead. He was playing a different game altogether. With Samir's help, we started to unravel Ezekiel's network of decoy accounts. Each one was built with an uncanny level of precision. These weren't the typical crude attempts seen in common financial scams. Ezekiel had forged identities complete with credit histories, social media footprints, and even fake correspondence between the account holders and the banks. Samir explained, he's not just creating fake accounts, he's creating lives. These aren't red flags to a system, they're invisible. I traced one account back to a seemingly ordinary woman named Mary Ellison. A deeper dive revealed Mary had passed away 3 years ago, her death buried in an obituary from a small-town newspaper. Ezekiel had used her information to open an account in her name, funneling funds through it like a ghostly puppeteer. As the layers unraveled, I found myself torn between admiration and dread. This wasn't the work of someone stealing out of desperation. Ezekiel was waging a war against a system he despised, using its blind spots as his battlefield. Determined to confront Ezekiel, I returned to Haven Outreach. This time, I didn't approach him alone. 2 officers accompanied me, ready to intervene if he tried to flee. Ezekiel, however, remained seated at the shelter's communal table, calmly reading a newspaper. "Detective," he greeted me without looking up. "Back for more questions?" I sat across from him, leveling my gaze. "We know about the decoy accounts. You've been funneling money through identities that don't exist." Ezekiel folded the paper neatly and smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Identities don't exist, detective. They're constructs. A name, a number, a file on a server. None of it is real. What's real is how easily people accept the illusion." I leaned in, my frustration bubbling. "You're playing a dangerous game. This isn't about fixing the system. It's about proving you're smarter than everyone else." Ezekiel's smile faltered, replaced by something more raw. "No," he said softly. "It's about showing that the system fails everyone but the ones who built it. You chase me because I'm the anomaly. But how many others exploit this same system, unnoticed, because they wear suits instead of rags?" His words hung in the air, challenging me. For a moment, I wondered if he believed he was the hero of his story. I dug deeper into Ezekiel's past, piecing together the fragments of his life. Born in a small Midwestern town, he had shown extraordinary promise from a young age. By the time he was 20, he had earned degrees in mathematics and computer science. By 30, he was a rising star in finance, designing algorithms that made millions for his employers. But everything changed in 2008. The financial crash hit, and Ezekiel lost everything. His job, his home, his savings. He vanished into obscurity, retreating to the streets with nothing but his mind and a simmering hatred for the system that had failed him. The more I learned, the more complex the picture became. Ezekiel wasn't a common criminal. He was a man shaped by betrayal, driven by intellect and a desire for retribution. He didn't see himself as a thief. He saw himself as a mirror, reflecting the flaws of the world around him. As I uncovered more about Ezekiel's activities, I stumbled upon something that shook me. He wasn't keeping all the stolen money for himself. A significant portion had been quietly redirected to causes that benefited the homeless. Anonymous donations to shelters, payments for medical bills, and even scholarships for at-risk youth. It was infuriating. How could someone commit fraud on such a scale and yet use the proceeds to do good? Was he a criminal mastermind or a misunderstood vigilante? Grace Moran, the nonprofit director, summed it up best during a tense conversation. "Detective, Ezekiel is wrong, but he's also right. The system is broken, and he's exploiting it to help people who've been ignored. How do you prosecute someone like that? I didn't have an answer. The law was clear, but my conscience wasn't. To catch Ezekiel, I needed to outsmart him, a daunting task given his track record. I devised a plan. Create a fake grant program with an irresistible amount of funds, then leak the details through the nonprofits network. If Ezekiel truly believed the system was rigged, he wouldn't be able to resist exposing its vulnerability. We set up the account with meticulous care, ensuring it mimicked the real grants Ezekiel had targeted before. Then, I waited. Days passed with no sign of activity. I began to doubt the plan, wondering if Ezekiel had seen through it. But on the 5th day, the trap sprung. Transactions began to move, small amounts at first, then larger ones. Ezekiel was biting, but he was cautious. He moved funds at irregular intervals, testing the waters for any signs of pursuit. This time, though, I was ready. Undercover agents were stationed at the library, watching his every move. The moment he accessed the fake grant account, they moved in. Ezekiel didn't resist when they arrested him. Instead, he smirked and said, "Took you long enough, detective. I was starting to think you'd never figure it out." The fake grant program was a masterpiece of deception. We constructed an online portal with all the hallmarks of a legitimate initiative, complete with fake application forms, official-looking branding, and a plausible backstory. The goal was simple: tempt Ezekiel into exploiting it. I monitored the setup obsessively, knowing that Ezekiel would scrutinize every detail. Samir added subtle vulnerabilities to the site, designed to catch the attention of a master manipulator like Ezekiel. If he's as good as you say, Samir warned, he'll notice these cracks and go straight for them. Sure enough, activity began within 48 hours. A series of small, calculated transfers moved through the system, mimicking the patterns we had seen in his previous schemes. Ezekiel wasn't just testing the waters. He was studying the entire structure. Meanwhile, I stationed plainclothes officers at the library, discreetly monitoring his movements. They reported that Ezekiel was his usual composed self, but his intensity at the computer had increased. It was only a matter of time before he made his move. Ezekiel didn't rush. He was patient, methodical, and deliberate, letting the fake grant sit untouched for several days before making any significant withdrawals. It was as if he wanted to lull us into complacency, but we were ready for him. I spent those days on edge, replaying every step of the operation in my mind. What if he saw through the ruse? What if he found a way to outmaneuver us? Doubt crept in, but I pushed it aside. This was a chess game, and I had to stay 2 moves ahead. On the 6th day, Ezekiel struck. He funneled a significant portion of the grant money into one of his ghost accounts, then began dispersing it through his usual network of shell companies. The digital trail was unmistakable. It was him. We watched as he finished his session at the library, calmly logged off, and exited the building. It was time to act. Ezekiel was halfway down the street when the officers moved in. They approached him carefully, knowing he might attempt to flee. But Ezekiel didn't run. Instead, he stopped, raised his hands, and smiled. "Took you long enough," he said, his tone almost amused. "I was starting to think you'd never figure it out." The arrest was surreal. Ezekiel maintained his composure, even as he was handcuffed and read his rights. He seemed more curious than concerned, as if he wanted to see how the rest of the story would unfold. At the station, I questioned him directly. "You knew we were onto you," I said. "Why didn't you stop?" Ezekiel leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Because the point wasn't to get away. It was to make you see. Now you have the pieces. What will you do with them?" His words were maddeningly cryptic, but they carried a weight that lingered long after the interrogation ended. Ezekiel represented himself in court, and his performance was nothing short of extraordinary. He didn't deny his actions. Instead, he reframed them as a form of social protest. "The system is broken," he told the jury in his opening statement. "It leaves millions to suffer while rewarding the few. I merely showed you what happens when someone like me refuses to stay invisible." His arguments were compelling, and his eloquence made even seasoned attorneys uneasy. He presented evidence of systemic failures, pointing out how easily he had exploited loopholes that institutions were supposed to protect against. "If I can do this," he said, gesturing to himself, What do you think those in power are doing every day? The prosecution countered with hard facts. Ezekiel had stolen funds, forged identities, and manipulated the system for personal gain. But even they couldn't entirely dismiss the morality of his motives. The courtroom was riveted, and public opinion was sharply divided. Some hailed Ezekiel as a modern-day Robin Hood, while others saw him as a dangerous criminal. The jury's task was monumental. During the trial, investigators uncovered a storage locker linked to Ezekiel. Inside, they found his magnum opus, a collection of notebooks filled with meticulous calculations, algorithms, and detailed plans for his schemes. The notebooks revealed the full extent of Ezekiel's brilliance. He had predicted every possible outcome, including his own capture. One page even outlined how the fake grant trap would likely play out, with a note in the margin, "If they're smart, they'll catch me here." But the most chilling discovery was a manifesto, a handwritten document in which Ezekiel detailed his philosophy. He saw himself as a disruptor, someone who exposed the flaws in society by forcing it to confront its own hypocrisies. "The system will never change," he wrote, "until someone holds a mirror to its face." The manifesto was a key piece of evidence in the trial, both damning and illuminating. It showed that Ezekiel's actions were premeditated and calculated, but also deeply rooted in a sense of purpose. When I read the manifesto, I couldn't help but feel a pang of admiration. Ezekiel wasn't just a criminal, he was a visionary, albeit one who had crossed too many lines. The trial became a media sensation. News outlets ran endless debates about Ezekiel's actions. Was he a criminal mastermind or a misguided hero? Experts dissected his manifesto, arguing over whether his schemes were acts of rebellion or plain theft. Public opinion was sharply divided. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, some holding signs that read, "Free Ezekiel," while others demanded justice for his victims. Social media was ablaze with hashtags like #EzekielTheGenius and #NoExcuseForFraud. Ezekiel's story tapped into a broader discontent with society's inequities. For every person who condemned him, there was another who praised him for exposing flaws in the system. "He didn't just steal money," one activist said during a TV interview. "He forced us to confront the way we treat people like him, those we ignore until they become impossible to overlook." Inside the courtroom, the jury faced mounting pressure. The weight of the decision wasn't just legal, it was moral. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts. Ezekiel was convicted of fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. The judge, however, acknowledged the complexity of his motives in her sentencing remarks. "Mr. Ezekiel, your actions were illegal and caused significant harm," she said. "Yet, it is clear that you acted out of more than greed. You sought to make a statement about a system that has failed you and many others. While this does not excuse your crimes, it does provide context." Ezekiel was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. As the sentence was read, he stood silently, his expression unreadable. When asked if he had any final remarks, he simply said, "The system remains flawed. I'm just one man. Imagine what happens when the rest wake up." In prison, Ezekiel's reputation as a genius quickly spread. Inmates sought his advice on everything from legal appeals to financial planning. He began teaching classes on financial literacy, helping others understand the very systems he had exploited. Some saw this as evidence of reform. "Ezekiel's making a difference," one prison counselor told me. "He's giving these men skills they can use when they're released." But not everyone was convinced. "He's playing the long game," Samir warned me during a phone call. "Don't forget, this guy thrives on control. He's building influence, even behind bars." It was hard to say which version of Ezekiel was real, the reformer or the manipulator. Perhaps he was both. Either way, his story was far from over. The nonprofit managed to recover a portion of the stolen funds, thanks to the meticulous digital forensics team. The money was reinvested into the community, though the scandal left a lasting scar. Trust in charitable organizations wavered, and new security measures were implemented to prevent similar schemes. Ezekiel's case also sparked broader conversations about systemic inequality. Lawmakers debated reforms to address vulnerabilities in banking systems and identity protection. Meanwhile, Grassroots organizations used Ezekiel's story as a rallying cry for better support for the homeless and marginalized. As for me, the case left an indelible mark. It wasn't just about catching a criminal. It was about grappling with the gray areas of justice. Ezekiel's actions forced me to question my own role in the system. Was I just enforcing the rules, or was I helping to change them? If you like the story and want to watch more stories by Detective Lefebre, please subscribe to my channel and leave a comment below. Remember, the truth is in details.